Hey, this is Bryan.
And Shelby.
And you're listening to the Hyperspace
PodBlast. Aren't you a little short for a podcast?
Huh?
It's the Hyperspace PodBlast.
I like how our new intro is just saying that in a weird voice.
Oh, yeah.
It's good.
Okay.
Continuity.
Pew, pew.
It's the new
Pew, pew, pew.
Hyperspace PodBlast story group.
Welcome to Hyperspace PodBlast with Bryan and Shelby being weirdos.
That's true. That's very, very
That
accurate.
sums it all up. That's all you need to know if you're new. Welcome to our podcast,
Yeah.
where we talk about Star Wars and stuff.
We do it!
Man, we are something else tonight.
Yeah, just droning on. Anyway, so you often hear Star Wars referred to as a space opera. But what does that even mean, really? I mean, I think it's a phrase used to describe the blending of sci-fi and fantasy that George created with which to tell his stories. So with that in mind, we're going to discuss what about Star Wars is fantasy and what is sci-fi, and how the mingling of the two either works or pushes against itself in a galaxy far, far away.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, in terms of fantasy, what do you think are the most fantastical elements in Star Wars?
Well, I mean, the Force, right?
Yeah, I mean,
It's
that's
like the
easy-
no-brainer.
That's the no-brainer. But
Yeah.
aside from the Force, I mean, we can talk about the Force.
I think the Force is important because that's basically what really makes it fantasy, I think. There's some other fantasy elements that have been added outside of the original films, but I think, quite honestly, well, no, that's not true. I have another thing in mind. But for the most part, it's the Force, because the Force is magic, and magic is fantasy. You know what I mean?
Right, but I think that just the idea of, like, Jedi Knights. You know,
Okay,
that
so like the
structure,
Arthurian
yes.
fantasy. Okay, I see.
I think
you.
that the structure in which the galaxy is set up, with both the political structure and just the way that things work on specific planets, that alone is extremely fantastical. I mean, when you're going to Naboo, that seems very fantasy-like to me.
Yeah, you got knights and queens and sort of castle-like structures. Yeah, okay.
And you see that as well on Geonosis. I think Geonosis is extremely fantasy to me.
Well, yeah, the guy's name is even Poggle the Lesser. You know, they used to give kings little added names like that. That's a good point. Yeah. Interesting. See, you took it to more of a, I don't know, sort of low fantasy, like
It feels
legend fantasy, where I'm thinking more of like magic and D&D type fantasy, I guess.
I mean, I was thinking more of a D&D type fantasy. I mean, when you're having, like, the pod racing stuff, to me, like, Fode and Bede are, like, I don't know, the announcers at some sort of jousting tournament.
That's funny. See, I think that's super sci-fi-y to have an alien do something that's very, I don't know, in line with reality, but they just took it and made it an alien with two heads instead of two people. That reads really sci-fi to me. That's interesting that you...
I don't know. I think that... I know, it's funny that we're both looking at the same thing and thinking whether it's sci-fi or fantasy.
Yeah, which says that they're mixing the two very well, if it
Yeah.
could be read as either one.
Another one I think of is Jabba's palace. When, you know, I mean, he has, like, jesters and entertainment, and he's more...
Blowing my mind with this stuff right now, honestly.
Really?
I hadn't
You've
even
never thought of
considered
it this
that.
way?
No, it's funny because
Send them to the pits, you know,
yeah,
like, kind of...
it is. It's super fantasy. But every time I think about it, I think of it as sci-fi because it's aliens. I think that's why. I think I just think that
okay.
they're aliens, and then I'm like, okay, well, this is in space. It's sci-fi. I'm falling into the same trap as most normal people. What is wrong with me?
I don't know.
That's awesome, though. You're so right. Everything about him is this just overindulgent fantasy kingdom. Man, that's rad. I want to go watch Return of the Jedi now.
You're welcome.
With that fantasy lens, and I'll just freak out the whole time.
But if you think about aliens as more of creatures...
Well, yeah, think about them. It's like different races
Different
in D&D.
races in
you
D&D.
know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like the Gamorrean guards or orcs. Or porks.
Oh my gosh.
I'm really happy with that one.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, that's awesome. What a cool
I mean,
way
the
to
sand
look at that.
people, it's like you're going and traveling on the road and you're running across sand people, which are kind of like goblins.
Sort of. They're
And-
meaner than goblins. I
Yeah,
think.
they're meaner than goblins. But I mean, it's the same sort of level of, like, difficulty in defeating them. I don't know,
Sort of, yeah.
maybe goblins are more comparable to Jawas.
Yeah, that's better. they can be dealt with, and they're kind of cute in their own way.
There you
Yeah,
go.
that's awesome. That is good stuff. Here
There's
I'm
a reason
thinking like
there's a reason why Star Wars RPGs work so well.
that's true. They do transition to that whole idea of a role-playing game and of having those same sort of elements. That's a good point. But yeah, I was just thinking the whole time it's it's Star Trek with magic. So that's what makes it fantasy. It's way better than Star Trek. That was a terrible thing to say. I'm sorry, Star Wars.
Oh my gosh.
I'm sorry. I compared you to Star Trek.
Uh,
Anyway, the other thing I was going to mention was the music, because the music has that very sweeping orchestral fantasy sound to it, where most things that are sci-fi, especially for the time period, I think we've talked about this before, but it has that very like synthesizer-y
yeah.
I'm in space, and Star Wars isn't like that at all. I think that's
You
for
don't
me.
have like the ominous chords like wow.
Well, yeah, it's not the Blade Runner just dissident. Yeah, exactly.
Everyone's really enjoying this, I'm sure.
For sure. But yeah, it's one of the things that really puts it into that fantasy setting for me, having that music there the way it is. And I mean, just having John Williams as part of Star Wars is what really took Star Wars to the next level, I think.
Well, think about this. Like, you could take Lord of the Rings music and just throw it in Star Wars and
It would
cut
work.
it. It would work. It would
Mhm.
work just fine. And it would have the same sort of just,
Yeah, Game of Thrones.
yes.
And vice versa. You could take the Star Wars themes and, switch them in Harry Potter and it would work.
Oh my gosh. That's a good joke. That's deep cuts.
I know, thanks.
Right there.
Thank you. You're welcome, Phil.
Yeah, there you go.
But
I'm sure no one else got it, but that's all right.
The
For
point
every-
is, it is interchangeable, I think. I mean, Phil from Bright Tree Radio jokes that Ray's theme sounds like the Harry Potter theme. And I mean, John Williams has a style, obviously. But the music can be interchanged. But you can't put Blade Runner 2049 music into Star Wars. I don't think that would be so weird.
Jarring. It would
Yeah.
be jarring.
Or even like the old goofy Star Trek music. That wouldn't work
Just
either.
imagine, right now I'm imagining the Game of Thrones intro as the crawl comes up, and I'm into it.
Yeah, right.
And you're like, yeah.
A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
Yeah.
There's
a lot of singing in this episode now.
There really is. This is
I
like
was-
more singing than we've ever done in the entire
Yeah.
time of this podcast.
I'm surprised. I was not expecting it.
No, we're a little tangential, but that's okay. So yeah, what else do you have for fantasy? Because I had basically those two things. I was just like going to mention how they're so superfluous with the galaxy that they've become just part of the reality of the universe. Kind of like religion is for us. I mean, think about it. Religion is kind of like our magic that we just take for granted as being real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we don't even think about, like, there's made up magic, but we don't even think of religion as being magic, though it kind of is. The things in some of these religions that are done, especially Christianity, because that's the one I'm most familiar with, like, Jesus was a freaking magician, let's be honest.
Miracles.
Yeah, and we just say that, yes, he did that, but he had God backing him, but Jedi had the Force backing him. Same kind of scenario. It's just something it's out there, but it's just part of life, and we've accepted it, and it is what it is. So that's where I'm at with the fantasy and Star Wars.
Well, I think Star Wars also has a fantasy element in the fact that you have like a person and then they gain a party and then that party goes together to accomplish a goal.
Mm-hmm.
Which I feel like
Well,
sci-fi...
yeah, I mean, it is kind of like an RPG.
Mhm.
It runs like an RPG. You're very, very right.
I feel like in sci-fi, it's usually like sometimes people are a group, but a lot of times you don't have like a cause. It's just, I don't know, I think I'm just confusing maybe sci-fi with horror at this point. Specifically sci-fi horror is like, let's stay alive.
Yeah, that's true. You get that like alien predator vibe of let's not get eaten by the thing instead of let's overthrow the evil empire or, the evil king, sheriff of Nottingham, whatever it is, So how do you think those elements work within Star Wars? I think we've basically decided that they work pretty well.
Absolutely. And especially this idea of, you come from a very humble beginning, whether you're Anakin or Luke or Rey, you're kind of no one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you have all this possibility once you understand your power and begin to level up.
Right. Well, it's just like Harry, Harry's no one. Then he finds out you're a wizard, Harry. And, the hobbits are no one.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very fantasy trope story.
Fantasy trope is, to be no one and to go on and do great things and save the world, the galaxy, the realm.
Whereas, sci-fi, you have Star Trek. They're all just already, Kirk's a captain at the beginning. They're all part of the crew. They just start their adventure. They don't really build up. The characters get built up within the narrative, but they're already where they are. It's not like it's Private Kirk and he works his way to captain or something.
Right. I almost think that you have to start talking about Valerian, too, because I think that's the closest thing to science fantasy that we have other than Star Wars. I'm trying to think of other examples of science fantasy.
Yeah, I think everything else really just kind of moves one way or the other. I'd really say Valerian's more sci-fi. It has a little bit of a fantasy element with that, whatever that species was that had the pearls, and then they put him in that little weird dude and he makes more pearls. I mean, that's kind of fantasy-ish, but it's also sci-fi-ish.
Yeah, it's a lot of sci-fi stuff.
But that's another example of those two are already in their positions.
I think that is a common theme in sci-fi, that
they're established characters.
They're established, and then something knocks them down.
Yeah, or they have to do something above and beyond what their already established position would have them do.
Right, and a lot of sci-fi is like people here on Earth, they're high in the military positions or something like that. Or
there is a lot of military involvement in sci-fi, that's true.
Mm-hmm. Which is interesting, too, because we teeter on that in Star Wars as well.
Right, which I guess is a good segue into what about the sci-fi elements of Star Wars? And I think the obvious thing is we're in space!
Right, space. In space. And aliens.
Well, yeah, and I think the whole idea that it's not Earth, though, actually goes back to the fantasy element, because a lot of the sci-fi either has Earth as part of it, or we started on Earth, or it's way in the future. But this is a long time ago and Earth doesn't exist. Sure, there's humans, but
exactly. When I was thinking about this question, what's the most science fiction-y element of Star Wars, to me is midichlorians.
Dude, right? That's a freaking good point, which is hilarious because it's tied directly to the most fantasy element, really.
Which is why I think there's such a...
Mind blown.
Which is why there's such a clash, I think, whenever it comes to midichlorians, because it's so science fiction-y and it butts up right against the fantasy.
Well, yeah, we had this, so far we've been talking about a pretty easy relationship between the two. Like, they're going on a date and everything's going really well.
I'm not sure if I like where this is going.
I don't know where it's going. The point is, the sci-fi fantasy is getting along really well, and then you add midichlorians, which makes them get along perfectly well, but it's like too much. I don't know.
I like them.
Yeah, I think they're interesting, but they're just weird too.
Yeah.
Blood bugs. Force blood bugs.
Blood bugs.
But yes, that
really
is incredibly sci-fi.
I think that's the most science fiction-y we get. Because
science fiction has science in it, and midichlorians are 100% science.
Yes, they're science. It's quantifying. You have to take a blood sample and do a test. You're analyzing it and measuring someone's force ability from a scientific standpoint.
Mm-hmm. So it's taking the big fantasy element and giving it a science base, basically.
And maybe that's why people don't like them, because it bursts the magic bubble, because it's saying you're born with a certain amount of midichlorians, and that's it.
Yeah, like no matter how hard you try, you're like...
But in a way, it's like in fantasy, if you're a specific race, that allows you to do certain things.
True, yeah. Man, it's all the same thing, really.
Whoa.
Crazy. But yeah, I think that's a really good point with the midichlorians. But for the most part, it's the spaceness of it, the ships, all the technology. That stuff is the hard sci-fi stuff.
Yeah,
in my
all
opinion.
the blinking lights and
exactly. The klaxons and things like the Death Star and Star Killer, all the big bad weapons, all that stuff is so sci-fi.
And putting Han Solo in carbonite.
Right, yeah, exactly.
How sci-fi is that?
Mm-hmm. Though, I mean, it's kind of like a sci-fi version of being stared at by Medusa, if you think about it.
In a way, but you can undo it.
Or like just turning someone to stone with a magical spell or something. But it's just like the sci-fi version of that.
Right.
Which
and
is very
disintegrations in itself. Like, that you have these blasters that are like...
Yeah, you don't hear the word disintegrate a lot, like, in magical terms. Maybe you do, I don't know. But yeah, just the weaponry. Even the lightsaber, honestly, is a brilliant mix of sci-fi and fantasy.
Because you have your weapon that is very classic.
Your S word.
Sword. Sword. But adding a technological element to it.
Mm-hmm.
But yet you can only really yield that power.
Well, yeah, you have to have the fantasy power to do it, and you have to go through and find this magical crystal to make it work. So it's just, I think the lightsaber may be the epitome of the perfect blend.
Ooh.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that before we sat down either. I should really start thinking about these things before we record. I get like 2 ideas and I'm like, I got it figured out. We'll be fine.
Yep.
But that's not the case, I guess. And that's why we talk about it. Otherwise, I just write 2 sentences and be like, that's our podcast. You don't have to listen to it. Just read it.
Read our podcast.
Very innovative. Written podcast. How
like
hipster would that be?
Oh, man. Can't even go there.
Oh boy. But yeah, so how do you think those elements work? Is it a fantasy with sci-fi elements or sci-fi with fantasy elements, or are we finding out that it's a really sort of perfect mix, do you think?
I think it's a perfect mix, and that's why it's so popular, period. Because it grabs people who are interested in both genres. And as we were talking about at the beginning of the episode, you can look at the same thing, and I can see fantasy, and you were looking at it from a sci-fi point of view.
That's true. I think, too, when I first got in...
A certain point of view. I'm sorry.
When I first got into Star Wars, I was much more into the sci-fi end of things. But nowadays, I have really gone almost full tilt into fantasy stuff. So it's funny that I haven't switched my view of Star Wars, though. Like, it's pretty locked in to where I was viewing it as a very much a sci-fi franchise with fantasy elements, where you seem to be looking at it as a fantasy franchise in space.
Yes, I really think I do. And it's just, instead of, your steed, you have your land speeder.
Yeah, your trusty ship, really. They name their ships and they really like them. They take
and the traveling merchants with all of the droids.
Yeah. Good stuff.
I think that they work well together. They do push up against each other, as we discussed with the midichlorians.
Yeah, see, now it's a funny thing, because it seems like that should also be a really tight balance, kind of like the lightsaber is. But I think it's because of the way it was introduced later.
Yeah.
And the fantasy element of the Force was there. It was ingrained. Like, people were keyed into it. It was that magical element. And then all of a sudden, they were like, no, just kidding.
Right. Well, I think what it comes down to is every kid grew up thinking, I could have the Force and I just don't know. When in reality, you could take a blood test and figure out if you have the Force or not. Like, you have the Force, you don't. Okay.
You're still the same, except 5 minutes later, you can go figure out if you can or not.
Well, there's always that, hope that, my Force powers are just dormant or something. I haven't unlocked them yet. And then the fact that you can really kind of kiss that hope goodbye.
Yeah.
By
it's giving me
testing
like old Star Wars Galaxies flashbacks when you were trying to unlock your Jedi, and anyone could do it, but you had to do this specific set of things. But then in reality, it would have been funny if there were certain characters that even if you did everything right, they're like, nah, you can't be a Jedi. Sorry. Should have taken the test, bro.
I know, right? And, that also, it's like, well, if you can take a blood test and figure out your midichlorian count, why isn't it that just like when a baby is born, you take a blood test and then they're like, oh, well, you're going to go to the Jedi Academy and
maybe that's what they do. I don't know if they've ever, they said to Anakin, if he'd been born in the Republic, we would have identified him sooner. I don't know how they identify him. Maybe that's what they do. Maybe they go around and maybe part of going to the doctor and having your baby is he gets midichlorian tested and they're like, we'll be back in a couple years for him.
And that's the thing, too. Maybe you have...
him as a baby. That's annoying. You do that part. We'll steal him when he starts being cool.
I'm wondering... We'll steal him when it starts being cool. I wonder if you can have, like, a Jedi cut-off midichlorian count, but yet just not have the capability to use it.
Well, yeah, I think that would be absolutely a thing. Kind of like, what do they call him in Harry Potter, where you should be magical, but you can't do it?
Oh my gosh.
Squib, is that right?
I think that's right.
Yeah. So yeah, I think there would be something like that. But unfortunately...
Do you think that midichlorians would have been more accepted if they were introduced in A New Hope?
Well, yeah, absolutely. If there would have been something like, I don't know, when they're sitting there in Obi-Wan's hut, he's like, hey, look that way for a second. He's like, ow! What'd you do that for?
That's a good Luke.
Thank you. Trying to get my wine on. But, yeah, if Obi-Wan would have tested his midichlorian count, then he would have been like, great Scott! And winked to the camera or something. A little Back to the Future joke. Fourth wall breaking.
Wow.
No one would have ever seen Empire Strikes Back because they wouldn't have made it.
But, I mean, another thing that's like science fiction that we didn't even really talk about is droids.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's because they're so personified. You don't even R2, man. Dude doesn't even look like any kind of person, but he's got more personality than some of the actual other characters that are people or, aliens or whatever. But yeah, I think that's a good point. It is a very sci-fi element to have robots or, droids in Star Wars, but there are very much more characters than in a lot of other sci-fi sort of realms where they're just kind of extras, kind of more like pets, where they're actual characters, I think, in Star Wars, at least most of the time.
So, do you feel that Star Wars is a lightsaber or midichlorians?
I see what you did there.
Do you feel like Star Wars has that perfect balance? Or do you think that the sci-fi fantasy elements clash whenever they are face-to-face? Let us know on the Twitter at hyperspace_pod.
Hit us up on email at hyperspacepodblast@gmail.com.
And you can always check out our content on hyperspacepodblast.com.
Yeah, we got a couple nice posts up there from our boy Dave in Japan, who is really, really insightful and has some really good things to say.
He's brilliant.
Yeah, you really should go read that stuff. If humans still know how to read. Do people still read?
I think people read.
Yeah?
Maybe
if we put it on a video, they'd read it.
With the sound off.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, boy. And, while you're online and thinking, I don't like reading, I wish someone would read to me.
What a transition.
You can go to www.audibletrial.com/hyperspace and pick up your very own free audiobook and 30-day trial. You're ruining this for me. I was doing so well.
That's my job.
Oh, anyway, yeah, you can get a free audiobook, 30-day trial of Audible on the house, audibletrial.com/hyperspace. It's really great. I love it. It's my commute every day.
And if you have thoughts about Star Wars books, let us know.
Yeah, for sure.
We are always looking to have great conversations about them.
Yeah, if you want to write up a review, throw it on the old website. There's a submission place on the website where you can email it to us. We love to hear from you. We love to put you out there to the world.
And we just like having conversations about Star Wars with people.
True that.
So, like we said.
Speaking of, we're going to start our chapter chats about Thrawn Alliances here shortly. So
yes, I'm very excited. I
Keep
haven't
that in
started
mind.
yet, but...
And we have a very, very, very exciting special guest coming up in the next couple weeks to talk about writing as well. So, something to look forward to.
Exactly.
Anyway, I think we've blathered on enough. How about we say goodbye?
Goodbye.
Bye!